Mike was grinding beans for the morning rush when he overheard the conversation at table 7, flight patterns, aircraft vulnerabilities, and timing that made his blood run cold. While his customers saw casual aviation talk, Mike recognized the tactical planning of someone preparing to use aircraft as weapons, because the coffee shop owner pulling espresso shots had spent 12 years flying F-22 Raptors in classified air superiority missions. Welcome to Secret Human Stories. Before I tell you this incredible story of hidden expertise and protective instincts, tell me in the comments if you or anyone in your family or circle of friends has military service background, and if so, what branch or role they served in. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes the most dangerous threats are identified by people who learn to recognize them at 50,000 feet, traveling at Mach 2. Mike Stevens was everything the residents of Cedar Heights wanted in a neighborhood coffee shop owner. At 42, he had transformed the aviation cafe from a struggling business into the community's social hub, complete with vintage aircraft memorabilia and the kind of aviation stories that made customers feel like they were part of something special. For 4 years, he'd been crafting perfect espresso drinks while sharing tales of his commercial flying days that kept regulars entertained and curious about aviation. The cafe's aviation theme wasn't accidental. Vintage propeller blades served as ceiling fans, World War II fighter plane photos covered the walls, and Mike had an encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft that made aviation enthusiasts consider him a kindred spirit. He could identify any aircraft by sound alone, explain complex aerodynamics in simple terms, and had an unusual ability to spot aircraft at distances that impressed even experienced pilots. Regular customers at the aviation cafe assumed Mike had been a commercial airline pilot before opening his coffee shop. He had the bearing, the knowledge, and the kind of precise attention to detail that suggested extensive flight experience. When conversations turned to aviation, Mike would share stories about flying for the airlines that were technically true, but left out some rather significant details about the specific aircraft he'd piloted. But there was something about Mike Stevens that nobody in Cedar Heights could have imagined. The steady hands that created perfect latte art had once controlled the world's most advanced fighter aircraft in combat situations. The calm voice that took coffee orders had once communicated with ground control during classified missions that officially never happened. From 2008 to 2020, Colonel Mike Stevens had served as an F-22 Raptor pilot with the 27th Fighter Squadron, specializing in air superiority missions and advanced threat interception. For 12 years, he'd flown America's most sophisticated stealth fighter in operations that ranged from routine patrol missions to classified combat engagements that tested the limits of both pilot and aircraft capability. Mike's military aviation record was exceptional even among F-22 pilots. 247 combat flight hours across 3 classified deployments with a mission success rate of 100% and 0 aircraft losses under his command. He'd earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 air medals, and the unofficial respect of every pilot who'd flown alongside him in operations that pushed the F-22's capabilities to their absolute limits. But Mike's specialty hadn't been routine air patrols. His unique expertise was what Air Force pilots call threat assessment and interception, identifying hostile aircraft, analyzing their capabilities and intentions, and neutralizing threats before they could endanger American territory or Allied forces. These missions required split-second decision-making at supersonic speeds, perfect situational awareness in complex aerial environments, and the ability to distinguish between legitimate aviation activity and potential threats. The psychological demands of F-22 operations were extraordinary. Every flight Mike took involved operating technology so advanced and classified that discussing it with anyone without appropriate clearance was a federal crime. The responsibility was overwhelming, the technical challenges constant, and the knowledge that he was often the only thing standing between hostile aircraft and American targets created pressure that few people could handle. Mike's transition out of military service in 2020 had been carefully planned. After 12 years of high-stress flight operations, he'd wanted a peaceful life, where his aviation expertise could be used for positive purposes rather than threat elimination. Opening a coffee shop with an aviation theme had seemed like the perfect way to stay connected to the flying community, while avoiding the life-or-death responsibilities that had defined his military career. For 4 years, Mike had successfully convinced himself that his combat pilot skills were artifacts of a former life, that the hypervigilance and threat assessment capabilities he'd developed were unnecessary in the peaceful environment of a neighborhood coffee shop. He'd learned to discuss aviation as a civilian hobby rather than a military specialty, to share sanitized stories about flying that omitted classified details, and to focus on creating the perfect espresso experience rather than monitoring airspace for potential threats. But some skills don't retire, even when the person carrying them tries to. And on Tuesday morning, November 12th, during what should have been a routine day at the Aviation Cafe, those skills would prove that some vigilance never ends. It just waits quietly until the moment it's needed to protect innocent people from threats they'd never see coming. The morning had started normally. Mike was preparing for the 8 a.m. rush, grinding fresh beans, calibrating the espresso machine, and arranging pastries in the display case. The Aviation Cafe was beginning to fill with its usual mix of commuters, local business owners, and aviation enthusiasts who treated Mike's establishment as their informal pilot's lounge. At 8:23 a.m., 3 men entered the cafe and took the corner table near the window, Table 7, which provided clear sightlines to the regional airport visible in the distance. Initially, they seemed like typical customers, well-dressed professionals in their 30s, carrying laptops and speaking in the kind of technical language that suggested engineering or aviation backgrounds. But as Mike prepared their orders, 2 Americanos and a cappuccino, his combat pilot training activated automatically. 12 years of threat assessment had conditioned him to notice details that civilian ears would miss. The men weren't discussing aviation as hobbyists or professionals. They were conducting tactical analysis of aircraft vulnerabilities and operational planning. The morning departures follow predictable patterns, one man said quietly. Corporate jets typically depart between 8:30 and 9:15. Minimal security protocols, fuel loads optimized for range rather than safety margins. Mike's pulse quickened as he processed what he was hearing. This wasn't casual aviation conversation. This was reconnaissance planning focused on aircraft characteristics that could be exploited for hostile purposes. His F-22 pilot training had included extensive briefings on aviation-based terrorism threats, and these men were discussing exactly the kind of tactical information that preceded aircraft-related attacks. Fuel capacity determines payload potential, the second man added. Mid-size business jets carry sufficient fuel for sustained flight operations, plus modification space for additional materials. Mike continued preparing coffee orders while conducting the same threat assessment he'd performed during combat missions. The men's technical knowledge was sophisticated, their discussion focused on operational vulnerabilities, and their positioning near the window suggested surveillance of actual aircraft operations at the nearby airport. Using techniques learned from 12 years of intelligence gathering, Mike began covertly documenting the conversation while maintaining normal cafe operations. He couldn't alarm other customers or alert the potential threats to his surveillance, but he needed to determine whether this was genuine terrorist planning or simply aviation professionals discussing technical matters in unfortunate terminology. The assessment became more troubling as Mike continued listening. The men were discussing specific aircraft types, fuel loads, passenger capacities, and security protocols in ways that suggested planning for hostile use of civilian aircraft. Their conversation included references to maximum impact scenarios and target-rich environments that made Mike's military training scream warnings about imminent threats. Tuesday morning flights offer optimal conditions, the third man said. Light passenger loads, predictable schedules, minimal security oversight for private aircraft. Mike faced the same kind of life-or-death decision that had defined his military career. He could alert law enforcement and risk a false alarm if these men were legitimate aviation professionals. Or he could continue surveillance and potentially allow a terrorist attack to proceed if his assessment was correct and he failed to act. The decision point came when Mike heard specific details about aircraft modification techniques, payload calculations, and target selection criteria that left no doubt about hostile intent. These men weren't aviation professionals. They were terrorists planning to use aircraft as weapons, and their timeline suggested imminent action. Mike activated protocols he'd hoped never to use in civilian life, contacting federal authorities through channels he'd maintained from his military service. Using his classified security clearance and Air Force contacts, he reported a potential aviation terrorism threat requiring immediate investigation. This is Colonel Mike Stevens, retired, F-22 pilot with current top-secret clearance. I have actionable intelligence on suspected aviation terrorism planning at my civilian location. Request immediate federal response. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force responded within minutes. Mike's military credentials and specific threat reporting triggered protocols designed for exactly this type of situation. Credible aviation threats identified by qualified military personnel with appropriate security clearances. While maintaining normal cafe operations, Mike coordinated with federal agents to provide real-time intelligence on the suspected terrorists. His F-22 pilot training and surveillance and threat assessment proved invaluable for gathering the technical details that counter-terrorism units needed to evaluate the threat and plan intervention strategies. Subjects are discussing modification of Cessna Citation aircraft for payload delivery, targeting federal buildings during morning business hours, Mike reported through encrypted communications. Technical knowledge suggests professional aviation background with hostile intent. The federal response was swift and coordinated. FBI agents working with local law enforcement and TSA security established surveillance on the three men while verifying Mike's threat assessment through additional intelligence sources. Mike's detailed reporting, combined with his military aviation expertise, provided the technical analysis that confirmed the legitimacy of the terrorist threat. The arrests occurred 2 hours later, as the three men attempted to access the regional airport's private aircraft facilities. Federal agents found detailed plans for modifying civilian aircraft with explosive materials, target lists focusing on government buildings, and operational timelines indicating they'd plan to execute their attack within 48 hours. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated terrorism cell with connections to international extremist organizations. Mike's early identification and expert analysis had prevented what FBI counterterrorism experts later described as potentially one of the deadliest aviation-based attacks since September 11th. But the most important discovery was that the attack had been prevented not by high-tech surveillance or intelligence networks, but by a coffee shop owner whose military aviation training allowed him to recognize threat indicators that civilian authorities would have missed. Colonel Stevens, your threat identification and reporting prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack, FBI Special Agent Jennifer Martinez told Mike during the post-incident briefing. Your aviation expertise and military training were essential for recognizing the technical indicators that these subjects were planning to use aircraft as weapons. Mike's response reflected the ethos that had defined his military service. I just recognized patterns I'd been trained to identify. When you spend 12 years learning to protect American airspace, you don't stop watching for threats just because you're not in uniform anymore. The story of the coffee shop owner's hidden F-22 pilot background made regional news, but Mike declined most interview requests. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He just wanted to continue serving great coffee while maintaining the peaceful life he'd sought after leaving military service. But Mike's dual identity as cafe owner and counterterrorism asset created new opportunities to serve his community. The FBI asked him to provide training on aviation threat recognition for civilian business owners, and the Air Force invited him to consult on pilot transition programs that could better utilize retired military aviation expertise in civilian security roles. However, Mike's most important contribution was simply continuing to operate the Aviation Cafe as a gathering place for aviation enthusiasts, while maintaining the kind of vigilance that could identify genuine threats among legitimate aviation conversations. 6 months after the incident, Mike received a letter from the Secretary of the Air Force recognizing his actions as exemplifying the values of military service in civilian life. The letter noted that his threat identification had prevented a terrorist attack and reflected the highest traditions of Air Force service to national security. But the recognition that meant most to Mike came from his regular customers, who now understood that their favorite coffee shop owner was also someone who dedicated his life to protecting American airspace. The aviation stories he shared took on new meaning when customers realized they'd been hearing about F-22 Raptor missions from someone who'd actually flown them. Today, Mike Stevens still operates the Aviation Cafe as Cedar Heights' favorite morning gathering place. He still crafts perfect espresso drinks, still shares aviation stories with customers who love flying, and still creates the welcoming atmosphere that makes people want to start their day discussing their shared passion for aircraft. But his customers now know that their coffee shop owner brings more than aviation enthusiasm to his work. He brings the kind of expertise and vigilance that can recognize when casual aviation talk becomes something more dangerous. The steady hands that create latte art are also hands that once controlled America's most advanced fighter aircraft, and they never forgot how to recognize threats to the people and airspace he'd sworn to protect. Mike's story teaches us something important about the nature of service and the different ways that military aviation skills can benefit civilian communities. The F-22 pilot, who once intercepted threats at supersonic speeds, found a way to continue that protective mission in a civilian coffee shop, creating an environment where aviation enthusiasts can gather safely while maintaining the vigilance necessary to recognize when their passion for flying might be exploited by those who would use aircraft to harm innocent people. Sometimes protection comes from intercepting hostile aircraft at 50,000 feet. Sometimes it comes from creating warm, welcoming spaces where communities can gather to share their love of aviation. Sometimes it comes from recognizing threats that others would miss and alerting authorities before those threats can endanger thousands of lives. Mike Stevens learned to provide all three forms of protection, and his community is safer because of it. The F-22 pilot who became a coffee shop owner never stopped being a guardian of American airspace. He just found a different way to monitor for threats while serving people who share his passion for aviation. The hands that once flew at Mach 2 now pull espresso shots at civilian speed, but they never forgot how to recognize the difference between innocent aviation enthusiasm and the kind of technical discussion that precedes attacks on innocent people. Mike Stevens proved that military service doesn't end with retirement. It evolves into new forms of community protection that keep people safe while they pursue their passions, completely unaware of the threats that vigilant protectors prevent from ever reaching them.